Hi, I'm Barbara Bunker. I'm a group of one. I was trained in the early 60s. I went back to graduate school in my 30s, and I went to Columbia Teachers College, where Morton Deutsch and Matt Miles were working. And Matt Miles, who's a name that you don't probably know, did the first systems intervention in schools. And I was one of many research assistants. We watched interventions and we documented, basically. And I watched the staff plan, Ron Libet, Paul Buchanan, Goodwin Watson, all of the early founders from NTL were working in a suburb of Pittsburgh called Westinghouse Valley, and in Mount Vernon, a suburb of New York City. And we did survey feedback, that is to say, we collected data from the whole system, and then we helped the system figure out what they wanted to do to fix the problems in the system. This was before future orientation. So we were problem oriented. We wanted to improve the system, sort of small group improvement. And in that same time period, in the middle 60s, the first group of people came together who actually called themselves OD folks. And they were, I'm not naming them all, but Billy Albin, Warner Burke, and a group of people in the New York City area formed a network which became the OD network. They met for the first time in 1965. And that group met monthly and eventually developed into the OD network. And it was a very interesting time to be around because the whole field was dominated by men who were white. And NTL was all male and all white, except for Edie Seashore, who was an anomaly. And the only way you could become a consultant, I thought, was all the consultants were PhDs operating out of university bases. So the union card to become a consultant was basically to go to the, get a PhD and go to the university, basically. And you went to the way you got entrance into NTL, the club, was to go to the 9-week internship program at Bethel, Maine. Now you had to get admitted to this 9-week program. I went there in 1968, and I worked very hard to do that. The first week I was there, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. And I mean, it was a very uproarious time that all of this stuff was happening. And so what happened was that my dissertation stuff, which I was working on, got delayed because of the disruption in the social fabric, and Columbia went up in smoke that same year. Basically, we had riots on the campus, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very complicated time. In 1970, Harvey Harnstein, Marion Guinness, Barbara Bunker, and Warner Burke put together one of the earliest books on social intervention. It has stuff about OD in it. And at the same time, the University of Michigan was doing a lot of stuff around data feedback, and there were a lot of tensions with the West Coast, because the West Coast was not focused on systems. It was focused on individuals and therapy and personal development, et cetera, et cetera. End of story.
So we're going to all these, and many of us were going to these NTL trainings at this point. We were graduate students, we were young internal folks, we were, our big interventions were flip chart. We also could do one thing maybe, which was team building. Sometimes we could do survey development, but that was sort of, touch and go. But we were full of energy and self-discovery and learning things like body-mind connection, and kind of had this sort of sense of just go out and do good work. But there was a lot of social research and theory going on, but also a lot of experimentation, because there weren't a lot of books. And there weren't a lot of, quote, OD programs. So there was a sense that you could kind of make it up. And then we had the Johnson administration and lots of, funding a lot of this research. So it was pretty pretty dynamic time. We had things like Earth Day and feminism and business schools trying to introduce things like organizational behavior and things like that. So where we are, we started to talk about the implications in that we're still inventing. We kind of grew up with that sense of openness and experimentation. We want to still connect many of us to community work. We still want to kind of come back to that roots of community. We feel like there's a real separation now between academics and practitioner, and fragmentation of theories. Going back to many of us coming out of this group dynamics and steeped in that theory, we're a little remorseful that it's not being taught in the OD programs today. And that led to a discussion about, well, maybe we've got all these geographically dispersed teams, so maybe it's global group dynamics or something like that. But we wanted to let you know that the flower children are not dead. This sense of being grounded in theory, but there was a lot of experimentation, so there was a sense that the community needed each other, so that there were a lot of like-minded people who didn't know what they were doing, but there was some kind of comfort in that.
The sense that there's a momentum building now by the 80s, and so what we discovered in our group was that those of us in the group began to come to OD in a variety of ways, actually, through activism, through the nonprofit sector, through business and so forth. We began to evolve into it. And the world was changing. In the 80s, there was a nexus of many sectors that brought on this change. One of the things that we saw was that government services began to be cut, and then that, by necessity, forced the nonprofits to come to rising. We even heard that it was at that time in the 80s that Peter Drucker formed his foundation for nonprofits, and expressed to the world that he declared to the world that the nonprofits were the best run companies in America, or organizations in America. So there you go. And so we believe that it was at this point that the work became now not just emerging, but very significant and necessary to the world. There was citizen leadership that began to emerge across sectors, and we saw the rise of technology, specifically communication technology, so that the way that we were connecting with each other, which is very much what this work's about, in communicating, began to change. So we saw in general some paradigm shifts, a turning point we sensed in the 80s. The third wave was written, Alvin Toffler, so some visionaries. And what was coming out of the innovation in the 80s was a movement now to look at, to study, to work more with what brings organizations alive. We had future search, the early inquiry there, appreciative inquiry. We had, thank you, we had quality circles, and all of those things that were going on in the 80s we felt related to employee engagement, a growing valuing of diversity, and an awareness with Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Bhopal, an awareness of environmental influences on us. Okay. And an interrelatedness that was connected. So what I'd like to leave you with as we merge into the 90s is the feeling then toward the end with the Berlin Wall coming down of now a sense of possibilities that began to come into our field, we think, because now we saw in the world possibilities for things to happen that we never thought could happen.